Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over the Tarrasch Defense, which is a variation in the Queen's Gambit decline lines. Queen's Gambit starts out with d4, d5, and then c4, followed by e6. This is the Queen's Gambit decline, and then knight c3, pawn to c5. This is the Tarrasch Defense. It's a pretty aggressive line from black to counter the center control of the board. The specific lines we're going to be going over today, the first is the main variation, that is the pawn taking here on d5. We're also going to look at knight to f3, as well as just e3, solidifying the pawn chain here from white. So the first variation, the main line, is the pawn taking here on d5. Black's always going to capture on d5, and this is nice from black because it opens up both of the bishops. Many times when black opens, especially in the Queen's Gambit decline lines, it's very difficult to get both of the bishops involved into the game, but you can see already this dark square bishop can get outside the pawn chain, as well as this light square bishop as well. White has two responses. One's going to be to take this pawn here on c5. The other one is just going to play knight to f3. Development move, controlling the center of the board, protecting this pawn here on d4. So the first one we're going to look at is if the pawn takes on c5. There's a lot of ways that black can respond here. We have just pushing forward with d4, attacking this knight right here, the bishop taking here on c5, as well as just playing knight to f6, protecting this pawn here on d5. I am going to go over all three options, but I do recommend playing the pawn pushing forward here to d4. I think this is, if you have an isolated queen pawn, I think pushing it up the board and putting pressure on your opponent is the best way to go about it. If you have an isolated queen pawn and you just allow your opponent to aim all of their material at that, it really creates a weakness for you. So I like to take that opportunity and flip it on its head and really attack my opponent with that. So attacking the knight here on c3, they have a couple options. They could look at it and say queen to a4 check, and I'm just going to go ahead and take this material here on d4. That's not going to work though, because knight to c6, this not only stops the check but also protects this pawn here on d4. Now, they could even come down to knight to b5, attacking this pawn on d4, but then we play bishop takes on c5, and we have the knight, the bishop, and the queen all protecting this pawn. So queen to a4 is not going to work for them. They could also play knight to e4, since their knight's under attack, really need to be moving that knight here. In this case, we are going to play knight to f6, attacking the knight. Now, they could go ahead and take our knight here. That's fine. We do want to capture with our queen here. I don't want to blow up our king side protection of the pawns. And from here, maybe they play pawn to b4. We played knight to c6, attacking this pawn right here, completely exposing their queen side of the board, just pushing up their pawns here, have no queen protection, don't have their light square bishop involved into the game because their e-pawn has not moved as well. If they continue pushing, we can just counter with something like a5 and really blow things up. But we do have both of our bishops involved into the game. We have our queen involved into the game. We have this pawn here, although it's an isolated queen pawn. It's putting a lot of pressure on many of the squares white would want to go to, and we do have a knight here on c6 that can easily get involved into the game as well. Sometimes they don't take that knight here on f6. A lot of players, anytime they see knights come to f6, they immediately play bishop to g5. This pins down the knight to the queen. It also allows them to play something like e3 while getting their dark square bishop involved into the game before it gets blocked off by something like e3. In this case, we're just going to play knight to c6. This adds another defender to this pawn here on d4, which is definitely what we're looking for. The reason I prefer the move d4 after they take the pawn here on c5 is because I think if, let's say, bishop takes here on c5, which, hey, black got that material back, both sides, two pawns down in material. Black has both the bishops involved into the game, but things get pretty tricky if they play queen takes here on d5. Yes, we could just take with our queen, but if they take here, then they're threatening this knight to c7 check, forking the rook here. And you can see white's up a pawn in material, and without our queen, we're really left in a tough spot. Now, we do have the move queen to b6, and this is threatening this bishop coming and taking here on f2. If you think your opponent may not play optimally here, then this could be an option for sure, because they could play a mistake. They could play something like queen to e5. Check, and we play knight to e7, and it's pretty enticing for them to take this pawn here on g7, and they're like, okay, what's the big deal here? I'm going to go ahead and attack this rook, but we do have the move bishop to f2 check. King comes to d1, now rook to g8. Maybe they try to gobble up more material. Queen to h7. Yes, our king is completely in the center of the board, but after bishop to f5, attacking this queen here, our rook is protected by the knight. This queen right here on b6 is protecting the bishop. You can see their king is exposed as well. We can start to have a lot of attacks on board, and white's going to have a pretty tough spot in this example. But if they don't play queen to e5 and try to give a check, if they just play the move knight to e4, this defends the pawn here on f2. And now black really doesn't have a strong attack. So I think this move here on e4 stops it for me as far as actually wanting to play that bishop taking here on c5 right away. Now the other option is black has the option of pawn taking here on c5 and then knight to f6. They could just defend this pawn right here, maybe b4. We played knight to c6, and they have a couple options here. They could defend with pawn to a3, protecting this pawn right here, and then we just push forward, attack their knight here. I always recommend using that isolated queen pawn to attack. Maybe knight to a4, pawn up here, b5, attacking the knight. They could en passant and take the pawn, but that's fine. We play pawn takes here on b6. The rook is attacking the knight here on a4. Knight on a4 is just awkwardly placed, and we still have both of our bishops can easily get involved into the game. Black should be okay in this spot. And also, if we instead don't say a3, they could just push forward with b5. That's fine. We're still going to push forward here with d4 attacking. Maybe they come a4. We play knight to e4. Things can get pretty tricky here with queen to a5 check. Now, after the queen takes, we can gobble up that material as well. So as far as my rank, I think d4 is probably my favorite, followed by knight to f6, and then followed by bishop taking here on c5 as far as how I would respond if they take this. But they don't have to take here on c5. They could also just play knight to f3. If that's the case, we're just going to play knight to f6. Said it before, many times you play knight to f6, they are immediately going to play bishop here to g5. We're going to play knight to c6. The key difference here is if they play bishop takes on f6, we don't want to take with our queen. Before I said, yes, you do want to take. This is a situation you don't, because they can now just play knight takes here on d5, attacking the queen right here, also threatening the knight coming down here to c7. So in this instance, with this specific setup, the bishop takes here, I do recommend taking with your pawn right here. Now if we come back, maybe they don't play bishop here to g5. Many times players like to fianchetto on the king side of the board. I've seen in this Tarrasch Defense, so maybe g3, and we're still going to play knight to c6 here, bishop here g2, and then we take with our pawn here on d4. They take with their knight, and then we play bishop here to c5, attacking the knight, also threatening behind that the f2 weakened square. We can castle on the king side. And now you can see both sides are equal in material, but black has a pretty good setup. Also opened up for the light square bishop to get involved into the game. So things pretty good if they decide to go the knight to f3 route. The next variation is, what if they don't take here on d5? What if they instead play knight to f3? Just simple development move for the knight here. We're going to go ahead and take with our pawn on d4. Anytime we play up here to c5, we are attacking the center of the board. And if they're not going to take their pawn, we are definitely going to capture their center. Now, they have two options. They could take with their knight. They could take with their queen. Knight seems more reasonable to me. We're just going to play knight to f6 here. Anytime they play this, they could just take with their pawn. We're just going to take with our knight right here. And if they take, we do have the isolated queen pawn that's completely fine. Many times, instead of taking, they could just play the bishop to g5, as we've talked about before. We're just going to go ahead and take that material here on c4. Now black is up in material. We've only given up one pawn. White's given up two, which is pretty rare in the Tarrasch defense because usually white has an extra pawn, but black has more development, can get their bishops involved into the game, and can put a lot of pressure with their isolated queen pawn on the opponent. But in this case, you can see black is now up in material, and if they take, then we can take with our queen. We don't have to destroy our king side of the board because they don't have any threats of taking extra material. Now, if we come back and say, what if they don't take with their knights? If they take with their queen, I think this is pretty poor because anytime the queen here on d4, we could just play knight to c6, attacking this queen. They could play something, queen to h4, we exchange, but after the exchange right here, we take on c4. Black is up in material, and white's just awkwardly placed. The knight here on h4 is not doing much good at all. They could also play their queen somewhere else. Queen to g4. You never know exactly where they're going to go here. But this gets tricky with pawn to d4. And where exactly do they go? Coming back to b1 feels pretty bad. They're just losing so much in development. That's two moves that they've brought it out here to c3 and then moving it back here. e4 doesn't work because of f5. This forks the queen and the knight here. That's not good. They maybe look at knight to b5 and say, okay, now I have two knights and a queen all attacking this pawn. Maybe that feels good because now black is overloaded because he only has two pieces. But now we can just play pawn to a3 and said, go ahead and take that pawn. That's fine with us because after they do, we can now play bishop here to b4. And after bishop takes, or bishop to d2, and we capture here, now knight takes on d2. And this is where we've removed one of the defenders. So the knight here on f3 was defending the square. So after knight takes on d2, we can now come up with queen to d4, and we're in a pretty good spot. The last variation we are going to look at is if they play pawn to e3. A lot of players, if they see a very aggressive move like the Tarrasch defense is, they get pretty defensive, and pawn to e3 does exactly that. It solidifies the pawn chain, so if we do capture here, then they can just recapture, and so it allows them to play pretty safely. Now, if they do play that e3, we're just going to play knight to f6 here, and now if they decide to capture, that's completely fine. It's going to look very similar to some of the other variations that we've looked at. If they just don't want to take material at all, that's just not in their game plan. That's part of the reason they play e3. Let's say they play knight to f3. We're going to play knight to c6 here. Maybe they play bishop to d3. And this is one of those instances, anytime you see bishop coming here to d3 and you have a pawn that can capture in the queen's gambit, usually want to capture that material because they're going to be capturing with their bishop. They've essentially lost a move. They brought their bishop here to d3, and now we're forcing them to move that bishop here to c4. So did lose a move. We're going to capture here on d4. They recapture, and then bishop here to d6. And you can see pretty good setup, and now we have white with the queen isolated pawn, so we can start to attack that. Go ahead and castle on the king side, get some safety here, but then yeah, black's game plan is going to be attack this isolated pawn right here, and black should have a good game. So that is the Tarrasch defense. It's always good to have different moves against the queen's gambit since it is such a popular opening, but hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. If there's other videos you'd like me to make, let me know in the comments below, or you can always email me at thechesswebsite@gmail.com. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.